Welcome to the Persuasive Mindset, your podcast guide to mastering the art of persuasion by exploring its role across diverse fields through a series of insightful conversations with experts. I am your host, Dr. Serena Mate-Delondra. Today, we have the opportunity to speak with Professor Joseph S. Nye Jr., a renowned scholar of international relations and former U.S. government official. Professor Nye is a University Distinguished Service Professor, Emeritus, and former Dean of Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He is widely celebrated for coining the concept of soft power, which is a transformative idea in global politics. His public service record is equally impressive, with key roles such as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs and Chair of the National Intelligence Council. In today's episode, Professor Nye reflects on his illustrious career in both academia and government, offering insights into the dynamic relationship between theory and practice. We dive into his pioneering ideas on soft power and leadership, with a special focus on the power of persuasion, an essential tool not only in international relations but in everyday life and leadership. Professor Nye contrasts persuasion with coercion and underscores its importance by stating the following.
Persuasion is the ability to affect others to do things you want them to do. And we all use it all the time in our social relations. People sometimes don't realize how important it is in politics. President Eisenhower, who is, of course, a military man, a general before he became president, once said that ordering people to do things with threat of coercion if they don't, said that's not the right way to run things. You want to get people to do things because they want to do them. And that's persuasion. He said, otherwise, just ordering people with a threat of coercion, he said that's like assault. Persuasion is the ability to get them to want to do it. And I think we all use a lot of persuasion every day. We don't run around beating each other over the heads, though sometimes people do. But persuasion is crucial to our social lives. And in that sense, when I developed this concept of soft power, which is the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payment, that grew out of this feeling that persuasion was crucially important.
Professor Nye also shares the 3 key lessons he learned while managing Harvard's Kennedy School, emphasizing the importance of persuasion in uniting people behind a shared vision.
And then a third point is to be able to persuade others, to bring them along in the vision that you have, and to get them to share common goals.
In this conversation, Professor Nye also offers a deeply personal reflection on writing his memoir, A Life in the American Century, and discusses the role of his wife Molly, whom he describes as his true life partner. This is a rich interview covering themes of leadership, governance, and personal growth, thus offering listeners a rare glimpse into the life of a scholar and public servant who continues to influence both academia and global policy. And now, let's dive into our conversation with Professor Nye. Enjoy! I'd like to start our conversation by talking about your memoir, titled A Life in the American Century, which feels at times as being peppered with short love notes to your wife, to help emphasize your gratitude to her for the support, patience, and love she has shown you throughout your career. Can you please share with us your views on the importance of having a supportive partner for someone who has high career ambitions?
Well, in the memoir, I say that life is like an onion or a set of concentric circles, and the outer circles are one's public accomplishments, government publications, and so forth. But the innermost circle is, for me, it's love, and that starts with my wife and then family and then friends as you move the circles outward. And without the stability that inner core provides, then you can get pretty much blown about on those outer circles. If you have that stability that comes from somebody who is basically a partner in life, it gives you a sense of being able to cope with other things. So I owe her a lot, and I tried in those little love notes, as you put it, to signify that this is not just my book; it's her book as well.
If I may, I'd like to go a little further into the importance of having a supportive life partner. In your memoir, you mentioned that you are aware you placed a heavy burden on your wife throughout your career and that you're very grateful to her for her support. Can you briefly address the impact you've noticed that frequent work-related travel has had on your marriage, and how did you manage to maintain such a strong relationship despite all the travel?
Molly, my wife, is an artist. She does ceramics. She used to have an art gallery. Obviously, that's hard to combine with that degree of travel. But it's also not like holding a job where you have to be in the office every day. It meant that sometimes she could travel with me. And so we had a lot of shared experiences in the travel, but it also meant that I was very loath to take trips which were longer than just a few days, unless it was absolutely necessary. But the answer is it creates a sense of tension, and then you try to alleviate it by things like having her accompany you whenever possible, and also trying not to take too many trips if any are avoidable.
In hindsight, it would be interesting to know, how did your transition from government to academia impact your relationship with your wife and her career?
I think when I left the government from the Carter administration and went back to teaching at Harvard, it gave me more time to be supportive of Molly. And that gave her the opportunity to start this art gallery with a number of her friends as partners. And I felt my job then was to try to be supportive. Now, it's still, even combined with an academic life, there's still tensions and pressures on time, but there was much more awareness that I owed her one, so to speak, and that in questions of, is this trip necessary or these activities necessary, I would have to turn down more things.
I would like to shift our conversation to the topic of needing to find oneself. In the book, you mentioned, and I quote, that you were born into a strongly isolationist family, end quote, and you argue that when you arrived at university, no one actually knew your name, thus, you felt like you needed to find an identity. Furthermore, you also mentioned that it was during your college years that you also worked at a mining camp, at which time you also felt like you needed to prove yourself. Then, all throughout your career, you appear to have had a constant search for the self and a need for reinvention as you shifted your work from academia to government and from writing to public service and then vice versa. I'm curious to know, why was it important for you to find an identity and prove yourself during your college years? Furthermore, why was it crucial that you constantly redefine or adapt your identity all throughout your career?
I think all humans, we are a social species, and all humans try to ask, who am I? And where do I fit in this larger picture? And we initially start with our parents and define ourselves in relation to them. Then at school, we define ourselves in terms of classmates. And when I went from a small school to Princeton, I was the only person from that school, and there were many other classmates who knew each other from larger schools, 10 or 20 people from the same school. And then you, again, are trying to say, who am I and how do you judge where you fit? And I think the reason I mentioned the mining camp is the author, Warren Bennis, refers to crucibles, which are intense experiences where a person sort of discovers who they are or reshapes who they are. The interesting thing at the mining camp was I was dealing with miners who couldn't have cared less about Princeton or about American East Coast schools or anything of that sort. You proved yourself by lifting a heavy creosoted timber in a mine or shoveling, ore into a cart to be taken out and dumped. And if you do that, then you put the other aspects in perspective. When I went back to Princeton, I figured I know who I am. I also hitchhiked alone across the country on my way back from the mining camp, taking 4, 5, 6 days. I can't remember now how many, but you're at the kindness of strangers for your transportation. These experiences gave me a sense of I should be a little less concerned about any particular set of people who are defining me, and I should spend more time realizing that I have to define myself, and this will change with different contexts, but the core of who I am is something I have to figure out.
While reading the book, one notices that persuasion has been a critical element in your roles as a husband, father, government official, public intellectual, teacher, mentor, analyst, and writer. I'd like to know, how do you define the concept of persuasion, and with hindsight, what has been its role and impact on your work?
Persuasion is the ability to affect others to do things you want them to do. And we all use it all the time in our social relations. People sometimes don't realize how important it is in politics. President Eisenhower, who is, of course, a military man, a general before he became president, once said that ordering people to do things with threat of coercion if they don't, said that's not the right way to run things. You want to get people to do things because they want to do them. And that's persuasion. He said, otherwise, just ordering people with a threat of coercion, he said that's like assault. Persuasion is the ability to get them to want to do it. And I think we all use a lot of persuasion every day. We don't run around beating each other over the heads, though sometimes people do. But persuasion is crucial to our social lives. And in that sense, when I developed this concept of soft power, which is the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payment, that grew out of this feeling that persuasion was crucially important.
Speaking of how you created the theory of soft power, in the book you also mentioned that it was a concept you initially outlined while working at your kitchen table back in 1989, and that in 2007 it had actually become a significant part of the great power competition and discourse, especially at the moment when the Chinese president declared soft power to be their national objective. I'd like to ask, what led you to develop the concept of soft power, and how has it influenced global politics, looking at it now years later?
As you mentioned, I developed the concept of soft power when I was trying to assess America's power in the world at the end of the 1980s, when there was a belief that the United States was in decline. And I totaled up the military power and I totaled up the economic power. And I said, there's still something missing. And that's the ability to affect others to get them to do what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payment. And that's what I called soft power. I published this in the book called Bound to Lead, The Changing Nature of American Power in 1990, but the concept was developed as an analytical concept, and it was a great surprise when it became picked up by political leaders in other countries, particularly when Hu Jintao, the Chinese president, told the 17th Congress of the Chinese Communist Party that China had to increase its soft power. I thought, boy, that's come a long way from the kitchen table. But I think more important than that personal aspect is the fact that realization of the importance of soft power and persuasion, I think is important if we're to understand how we work together in societies or polities, how we don't spend all our time with coercion or payment, though in some countries and in some situations that becomes a dominant form, but in most democracies it's not. So that's why an understanding of soft power, I think, is crucial for understanding life and politics in a democracy, but even more broadly.
How did you expand the use of the concept of soft power beyond the field of international relations? And as your work has become so well known and referenced over time, what kind of pressure has this placed on you?
If you're in the business of ideas, there's always the question of developing ideas. I think with the soft power, I originated it in, as I mentioned, in the context of international relations. But one of the things I did in developing it was to relate it to leadership. So in 2008, I wrote a book called The Powers to Lead, in which I said soft power is not just about international relations, where I developed this concept, but it's about leadership in everyday life. And I followed that then a few years later with a book called The Future of Power, in which I tried to put the pieces together of various types of hard economic and military power with soft power, and looking how these would be working in a period of cyber environment. And so in that sense, I didn't develop a new concept entirely, but I tried to broaden the concept and apply it in different contexts.
In the memoir, you mentioned that back in 2021, you wrote in your diary the following, and I quote, "With time, I have come to realize that concepts such as soft power are like children. As an academic or a public intellectual, you can love and discipline them when they are young, but as they grow, they wander off and make new company, both good and bad. There is not much you can do about it, even if you were present at the creation." End quote. Why do you apply human characteristics to the concepts and theories you create, and how has this approach influenced your work?
Well, I think when I started, or when I developed the concept, as I mentioned in 1989, there was a general view that the United States was going the way of the second Spain or Edwardian England. Paul Kennedy, the great British historian, had written a book called The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, which became a New York Times bestseller along those lines. I didn't agree with that, and in trying to explain it, why I didn't agree, I developed this concept of soft power. As the concept became more broadly used, it became misused. For some people, soft power was anything except military power, so they thought all economics was soft power. For other people, they thought soft power was too nebulous. It didn't explain anything. And so this is what I mean when your children become adopted or misled by But all you can do is try to remember what were the basic guidelines at the start.
Staying with the topic of academia, it seems to me and to many others who choose this as their career that in fact academia often requires what can be described as a nomadic life where career growth actually depends on moving to places where opportunities arise, especially if one needs to support a family. You mentioned that obtaining a doctorate was, during your time, good insurance, but today, a doctorate doesn't necessarily guarantee job security in academia. How do you view the current state of academia and job opportunities for new PhD graduates?
You deal in a world of ideas, and some ideas are more popular or fashionable than others. And if you're looking for employment, sometimes the ideas that you have are most original are not those that are best suited to increasing or gaining employment. So there are a lot of PhDs, for example, at Harvard in classical literature or in English who are finding it hard to get jobs as the universities turn away from the classical liberal arts to STEM, science, technology, and engineering and mathematics approaches, which is what students tend to be demanding today. So academic trends and changes make plotting a career path often difficult. And in that sense, you have to be prepared to move if to where opportunities exist. And a lot of people wind up teaching or in places where they would not have otherwise wanted to live, or of taking jobs that are not exactly what they wanted. So there is a degree of insecurity, a degree of nomadism. On the other hand, if you like teaching, if you like interacting with people and passing ideas along, to some extent, if you're able to do that, there's an intrinsic satisfaction to it, no matter where you pitch your tent.
Throughout your career, you've done several back and forth transitions between academia and government and have realized early on the importance of getting reacclimated to the new work environments by first listening and then acting. What are some examples of key management skills you needed to learn in order to advance and grow in your academic and political career? And what are some key transferable skills you've noticed between academia and government that have helped you navigate both fields successfully?
Well, academia and government are um, quite different in the sense of the importance of time and the importance of power. Obviously, time and power matter to both, but there's different premiums. For example, in academia, if I'm trying to write an article that will be published in a referee journal and will stand the test of time, that people will footnote it for decades, I want to get it exactly right. So getting it published by next month or next year is less important than getting it to a level of quality that would meet that standard of the referee journal. It may take several years. In government, in contrast, timing is absolutely crucial. If I'm writing a memo for the president to brief him on the visit of the foreign minister of an important country who is going to see him at 4 o'clock, and I'm working on it and working on it, and I think this is right now about a B plus quality memo. I'm just going to keep working on it until I get it to an A+ level. And you get it into his office at 5 minutes after 4, it's an F, total failure. So that's the difference in terms of the premium on time. The other big difference, of course, is in power. As you're developing ideas in academia, you have to be alert to aspects of power. All human relationships have power aspects, but the quality of the ideas can't just be determined by power. If you try to just develop ideas that are acceptable or fashionable among the people around you who may control your fate, you probably won't develop very good ideas. On the other hand, in government, you have to be alert to these changes in power. If you develop a brilliant policy idea, but you can't sell it to anybody, you can't persuade anybody about it, then it's not much value. It's not going anywhere. It's going to be put on the shelf. So that alertness to how do I form a coalition which can promote this idea and get it accepted and translated into action, that's central to government. In academia, it's not irrelevant, but it's not central. You need to have ideas that will stand the test of time. So both on power and on time, there are really major differences between the two. The interesting thing, as you mentioned, is going back and forth between them and adjusting your behavior and pattern of skills to suit the difference in the two environments.
Speaking of going back and forth between academia and government and vice versa, when you re-entered academia as a dean for 8.5 years, you joked that after the Pentagon, your vision of the Kennedy School was, and I quote, a fleet of 5 helicopters, end quote. From reading the book, we learn that as dean of the Harvard Kennedy School, you managed to balance a wide range of responsibility, and I'd like to just name 3 of them here. First of all, you contributed towards increasing the female proportion of the student body, faculty, and staff because at that time, women perceived the school as being an all-boys club. And you also managed to ensure political balance as you increased the number of foreign students accepted. Second, you encourage your staff to implement a set of rules within the Kennedy School regarding how one should treat romantic relationships between 2 consulting adults when one person had a direct position of power over another. And third, you helped create Oxford's Blavatnik School of Government, inspired by your work with the Kennedy School, and then you also did the same in Singapore, Berlin, and Dubai. Can you please share some general lessons you learned and some of your views on successfully managing Harvard Kennedy School?
The first important rule is to listen. The reason for that joke about responding to people who asked my vision for the Kennedy School just as I was starting to say I want 5 helicopters was to say something so absurd and silly that they would laugh, but I could put off a serious answer. I waited for a more serious answer until I had actually met with people and listened to them. And so as I met with students, with faculty, with staff, with colleagues from other schools, and so forth, I developed a picture of what I thought the Kennedy School needed. And I basically picked up the points that you mentioned. But if you'd asked me about those points, the changes that I made as I just stepped in the door, so to speak, going from the Defense Department to the Kennedy School, I might have said things that were irrelevant, or I might have missed the things that you mentioned that basically I decided were very important after talking to people. So the first advice is to listen. The second is to put together people who can implement the ideas. Nobody runs anything large by themselves, and the effort to do so can often lead to massive problems. I mean, that's something I learned in government when I first thought I could solve problems by staying up later and later and reading more and more and writing my own answers. I realized it can't be done. And the same is true on a much smaller scale in academic administration. Having a good executive dean, a good dean of students, a good development officer, this is what makes for success. Or as some people have once put it, surround yourself by people who are smarter than you are and listen to them. So getting the right people to implement things is crucial. And then a third point is to be able to persuade others, to bring them along in the vision that you have, and to get them to share common goals. I mean, academics, like anybody, have their own private interests. Most of the time, they would like to be left alone to do their own research and maybe to teach some of it to students. But when you try to persuade them about the common enterprise, that's where the persuasion comes in. And so I developed offsites and retreats and a faculty project on how to think about trust in government or visions of government for the 21st century to get people out of their separate silos and thinking about some things in common. So I think those would probably be the three major lessons I would learn from my experience as dean of the Kennedy School.
Throughout your career, you have had the opportunity to teach at prestigious institutions all over the world, including Harvard University, as we've already mentioned, Oxford, and Sichuan University. In 1968, you also became a Carnegie Endowment International Peace Scholar in Geneva and conducted research and also taught at the Graduate Institute of Higher International Studies, where I also obtained my PhD a few years back, and I was lucky during that time to attend your 2017 lecture titled, "Are We Seeing the End of the American Liberal Order?" Can you please share with us some of your reflections on how that experience compared and contrasted with your other teaching experiences? And what do you believe is the continued importance and role of Geneva in the future development of international cooperation?
Well, I loved my period at the Graduate Institute. It was a fine institution with good students and a very interesting set of faculty. One of the big differences from the Institute and, let's say, Harvard, where I'd come from, was there was much less interest in the disciplines of political science or economics per se, and more interested in practical applications, particularly to international institutions. And that was a different atmosphere and climate. And that reflects on this point that Geneva, as the former seat of the League of Nations and the International Red Cross and so forth, has this tradition of international institutions and attention to it. And that, I think, remains a crucial asset, something that the Graduate Institute has been able to cherish and to nourish. And I think whether we're now going through a phase in world politics where the role of international institutions and organizations is being downgraded. And if so, that will cause problems, I think, for the Graduate Institute.
I'd like to briefly address the topic of retirement within the government field. And particularly, I'm curious to learn what are your views on the concepts of retirement and ageism?
It's a very important and very timely question. When do you ease off? When do you let go? And how do you let go? I mean, I personally think the president should have run for one term and then passed the torch to a younger generation. But that is an example of something that's a more common problem that we're seeing in many countries now, which is a generation of people in their 70s and 80s who are holding on. Now, they always think they're indispensable. I think it's important to know when to step back and how to step back so that you don't obstruct others. But still, if you feel you're contributing, getting that balance right is not easy. And as we're seeing now, many countries are in the process of leadership changes where it's hard for the leaders to get that balance right.
Looking at the craft of writing, back in 2001, you mentioned that you spent 3 months at All Souls College in Oxford, and during those 3 months, you wrote a book that summarized your views at that time, which was titled The Paradox of American Power: Why the World's Only Superpower Can't Go It Alone. This book became the most widely read work that you've written, and it also made it on the Washington Post and the Economist list of best books of the year. I'm curious to know, how were you able to write such an impressive book in just 3 months? And can you please briefly share some advice based on your writing process?
Well, if you can get to a situation like All Souls College where all your needs are taken care of and there's no teaching, and you've also been thinking about a subject intensely so that you know what you want to say and how you want to say it, then I find I can get up early in the morning and write for 6 or 8 hours and get a fair amount down in a first draft in a very short time. I wrote a book in the 80s called Nuclear Ethics when I was a fellow at Balaj 4 weeks, and I wrote a first draft of it. But again, it's something I'd been teaching about and thinking about, so I knew what I wanted to say. So the hardest part of writing is to think of what you want to say and how you're going to organize it. If that's been taken care of in advance, then I find the writing process quite quick. In the case of the memoir, A Life in the American Century, I fortunately had 50 years of diaries. For some odd reason, I had been keeping diaries, just one page per day, which I write before I went to bed at night. And that meant when I was trying to recapture the feeling of what it had been like to live through this period, I could refresh my memory quite quickly. And it was interesting to see very often your memory plays tricks and things aren't exactly as they were. And that's where the diaries come in. So writing the memoir, I think that probably took about maybe 6 months or 4 to 6 months.
As we come towards the end of our conversation, I'd like to ask you a question that is based on your professional experience within academia and also that is based on your experience as a young assistant professor of government. And my question is, would you like to share any advice or suggestions with junior professionals and academics who are interested in pursuing a similar career path to yours?
It was a bit easier than it is today with the increased emphasis on professionalism in the disciplines. There's sometimes a disdain for policy experience. And I guess if I were to put it in terms of a strategy for a young academic, it's nail down your academic credentials first. Get published in referee journals, get a book or two which is reviewed as really first rate, and then think about a period of policy experience. And then when you come back from that, that policy experience can enrich the next phase of your academic life. But in some ways, the path between government and policy, or between academia and policy, is a one-way street. It's easier to get out of academia into a policy position than to go from a policy position to a first-rate academic institution. So get your academic credentials nailed down, and then think about what do you want to do in government or policy. But above all, this advice is whether you're in government or in academia, maintain your sense of integrity and curiosity. If you do things because you find them interesting and you accomplish them in a way that you can still live with yourself, then basically you'll be a success, no matter how that success is measured, because you've kept your integrity and you followed your curiosity.
And on that inspiring note, thank you for taking time to discuss your memoir with us today. And as the last question, I'd like to ask, what is the meaning behind the title you've chosen for your memoir?
I think it's been an interesting interview. I thank you for it. You've understood what I was trying to do in the memoir, which is a description of what it felt like to live through this period. And that's why I called it A Life in the American Century.
That concludes our conversation with Professor Joseph S. Nye Jr. If you enjoyed this discussion, please be sure to subscribe, leave a comment, and share this episode with others who might benefit from it. Until next time, be well!